Right, so good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, especially given the fact that we're so tantalizingly close to those Christmas breaks. So thank you for your time today. So as you'll see on the slide on your screen right now, today we'll be exploring embedding inclusivity and accessibility in your organization's digital strategy. I'm your host for today. I'm Vanida from Media Trust, tuning in from a slightly grey London, but it's brightening up. Let us know in the chat which organisations and locations you're joining us from. It's always nice to know who we have in the room, given the fact that we can't actually see you all. So as some of you may already know, this open webinar is part of the Heritage Digital Academy, a programme which aims to improve the skills and confidence of 500 heritage organisations. Led by Charity Digital, Media Trust is working alongside Dot Project, Naomi Corn Associates and the Heritage Alliance to develop and bring you this tailored training. So back to this session, our lovely trainer Roxanne Steele will be taking us through what is inclusion and equality, why it matters to consider accessibility when creating your digital strategy, and all the ways your heritage organisation stands to benefit from getting it right. We'll also touch upon what the law says and best practice amongst much else. So before I hand over to Roxanne and her colleague Nikita, I wanted to mention the very helpful Zoe from Charity Digital is available in the chat for any tech support or other questions. But any questions you have for Roxanne and Nikita specifically, please pop them into the Q&A box that runs along the bottom of your screen. So you should see two speech bubbles like on top of one another. And yeah, you can also upvote there. So if you see someone else post a question that you think is really important to answer, please give it a little thumbs up. And we'll set aside 15 minutes right at the very end to discuss these. So yeah, I can't think of anything else I need to mention. So over to you, Roxanne.
Before I unmute myself, great start to the session. Hello, everyone. Technical support here, clearly. Hello, welcome to today's session. As you've been told, my name is Roxanne and I'm from DNA as part of our partnership with the Media Trust and Heritage Digital. Today we aim to discuss the benefit of embedding inclusivity and inclusion into your organization's digital strategy. We understand that you come from a very wide number of spaces, and what that might look like is different, and you may have a number of staff and employees, but we really think these tools and tips are really actionable regardless of what size or what position you're kind of viewing the sector in. So this will not only help your kind of visitors and kind of the inclusion within your attractions, but actually look at the staff internally and the talent that you're able to approach. But before we start, I want to introduce myself and DNA. Excuse me. So DNA, for those who haven't heard of us before, we are a multi-award-winning disabled-led social enterprise which supports organisations to create inclusive cultures where everyone is valued and people can thrive. We specialise in training and consultancy, supporting both employees and employers, staff and students to be the best they can be. DNA is truly driven by authentic lived experience, with 85% of our team identifying as disabled or neurodiverse, and 100% of our clients said that they would return and use our services. I am part of that 85%. I come from a place of lived experience with cerebral palsy and mental health challenges. For me, I'm looking at the heritage sector definitely from a visitor point of view, but I can definitely give you that kind of support from a recruitment point of view as well. What that might look like for me is I use a wheelchair on a daily basis to get around, and I have the support of a PA to also support me. But actually, why digital kind of strategies are really important to me. I wouldn't be able to do the job I do without digital strategy. It's not a case of everything has to move to digital, but actually how can digital support what already works? So I'm going to pass over to Nikita just to introduce herself and say hello.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Rox. It's wonderful to be with you all this morning. I'm Nikita. I'm one of DNA's inclusion specialists. I've been with the organization for almost a year now, and come from sort of quite a roundabout background. Spent a lot of time in the creative industries beforehand, worked in advertising, did my time in museums and galleries as well back in the day. And then have ended up in the diversity and inclusion space, which is one of my true loves and passions. Like Rox, I also fall into that 85%. I come from the lived experience of both being born with a birth deformity and being very proudly dyslexic. So I'll be tapping into a lot of my lived experience and perspective as well today. And I'm really excited to talk you through everything we're talking about. I feel like sort of digital inclusion for the heritage sector is so key. I feel like the sector as a whole and the culture sector as a whole has been such a refuge for a lot of neurodiverse and disabled people in so many different ways. So it's just awesome to see the organizations thinking in terms of accessibility and inclusion and how we can really sort of ensure that we continue to, provide that space, that safe space, essentially. So excited to be with you today.
Absolutely. And to echo Nikita's point, this is a safe space for learning. While we'll respect everyone's views and try and get it right, this is a place where we may get it wrong or people may have questions, and that's absolutely fine. Today we'll be part of an interactive session. We will be using an online platform called Slido, and I will introduce how we access that in a few moments. But as we said, today we will be looking at the models of disability to really understand how that kind of affects our view on disability. What is accessibility? Digital accessibility and why it's so important. What does the law say? Then we'll give you tools and tips to be able to create accessible content, as well as those top tips for creating inclusive meetings and events. So as promised, we are moving into our interactive section of the session, just a bit of a warm-up question. You can join us on slido.com using the code MediaTrust15, or you can use the QR code on the screen. And the first question we've got for you as a bit of a warm-up is, why is digital accessibility important within the heritage sector? And thank you for putting that link in the chat.
Slido often can be easiest to access via your phone, but it also works on your web browser as well. But let us know if you're having any struggles. And as you start to populate, we'll start to see the answers pop up on the screen in front of us. And this is just a really interesting way of asking this question for us to really sort of gauge what is really key for all of you as well. And we can ensure that we're sort of tailoring our content to make sure that we're covering what you're interested in and looking for as well. So we've got our entries coming through, wanting to reach as many people as possible. Equity, fantastic, love that word. We'll tap into that a bit later. Heritage is for everyone, not excluding people. Inclusivity, expand reach of audience and making heritage for all. Make sure we can reach everyone, accessible, everyone can enjoy it. History, stories and experience are important for all audiences. I love it. Because we want everyone to enjoy and connect with their heritage. Fantastic. This is fantastic to see.
Absolutely. No problem if you're still accessing Slido. If we move on, the question will still be available, so that will be available to us as well.
Okay. So, should I dive in here, Rox?
Yes, if you'd like to, yes.
Sure. Okay, so we're going to be talking through the models of disability first. So this is really the sort of theoretical positioning of what we're going to be sort of basing the rest of our content on today. So the models for me is probably the most exciting part, and recognizing that, you know, actually the way we view disability in itself is a social construct, and it's something that we can actually shift and adjust as we start to understand it more and expand our thinking around it, and really question how we think about disability. So that's what we mean when we say models of disability. These are the lenses through which we view disability through. So it's about how society defines and explains disability. And there's a whole range of models. I think currently there are about 9. But today we're going to talk you through the 3 most important models. So that would be the medical model, which is probably the most prominent model, the social model, which was kind of fueled by the disability activist movement, and then the celebratory model, which is sort of the ideal, which we would love all organizations and all people to really start encompassing. So back to you, Rox, for the medical model.
Okay, so the medical model is where the person is viewed through a medical lens, and that might be through a professional lens, where the problem isn't with the individual. So I'm the person with a condition, with an impairment, with a problem. And a lot of professionals want to fix me and associate me with negative terms such as disability, difficulty, disease, something that needs to be fixed or cured. Professionals identify the impairment and its limitations and often take action regardless of individuals' preferences. Now, we're not saying obviously you are in the medical field, not at all, but what I think is really important is to reflect on how this has shaped our culture and how we kind of interact with disabled people. I think we have a tendency, or have in the past, not making blanket assumptions, that, for example, if I was to phone up and ask for access requirements, you often get asked what's wrong with you rather than the barriers that you may face. So we will start to move it towards the social model, so that the space that we're in currently, I would be considered disabled by society. So the problem isn't with myself, it's the barriers imposed by society. And these aren't necessarily physical barriers. We believe that if society is different, the individual will be enabled and in fact not disabled. Society is responsible for ensuring inclusivity and helping to remove barriers for people with equal opportunities. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Nikita, or would you like to do the celebratory model?
I think with the social model, I think it's, you know, this was very much, like I said, came from the disability activist movement. So this was something that was spearheaded by disabled people, for disabled people, to really sort of shift that focus away from us being the problem. But it's worth bearing in mind that the social model, as amazing as a concept as it is, doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, especially people who have chronic pain or illness in that respect. So, you know, as much as society would be different, that person will still be feeling what they're feeling internally, which is why we like to really focus on the celebratory model, which is the view that, you know, everyone is valued, everyone is a unique individual. We all have our own brilliant skill sets and capabilities that we bring to the table. So by making those proactive adjustments, we are therefore enabling people to reach their full potential rather than creating barriers or trying to tackle barriers. We are thinking proactively about accessibility and inclusion, which ultimately then creates that sense of belonging that we all really crave and thrive off of. And that develops that environment where everyone can thrive. If we're all being valued for who we are and recognized for who we are and what we bring to the table, then we will all thrive in that space. So
Thanks, Nikita. So yeah, the common barriers to participation in the heritage sector, as I said, this can look like a visitor or staff or a volunteer. And as we said, not all barriers are physical, so we're not always thinking about that physical space, you know, that grade 2 listed building, because we recognise not all barriers, physical barriers, can actually be removed. There's also attitudinal barriers. So for example, consideration, whether you seem like the sort of person that should be kind of moving into the heritage sector, that kind of preconception of what that looks like or who that is, can affect people's barriers. There's also financial barriers, not only to access sites and spaces, but it might even be financial barriers to be able to access additional support to be able to go to these spaces. There's also communication barriers. So this is something that will help you break down with some of our tools. Are we effectively communicating inclusively and reaching the audiences we need to? And if we're not, are we creating information barriers? Is information available? Is it understandable? Is it wide enough to cover the people that might contact you? And is it proactive? So is it thinking of who could contact you in the future?
So looking at diversity within disability, it's really important to bear in mind that disability itself is an umbrella term. And when we look at disability within the Equality Act, which we'll come on to in a second, what does that cover? So that entails everything from if you're facing mental health challenges, if you have any sensory impairments, so being deaf or being blind, for example, any kind of physical differences, any cognitive differences or neurodiversity, so being on the autism spectrum or being dyslexic or ADHD, for example, and then also covering long-term health conditions as well. And that would range from, you know, having cancer or HIV to ME, or which is chronic fatigue syndrome, for example. So there's quite a range of diversity within disability.
Absolutely, and I think that just confirms that barriers, even though there are certain barriers, actually the way we interact with these barriers and how they can affect us can be diverse due to the level of disability or environment that we might experience. So today is definitely not about let's move everything online and nothing's offline, let's keep everything online that's accessible. What this is about is how can digital technology enhance that accessibility for everyone and ensure that it's universal? Because as I said, we do understand that in heritage, there are some spaces that you can't remove the physical barriers. But what you could do is use technology to help people feel more confident and access services. For example, maritime and transport. In some cases, you have to book 48 hours in advance, so there isn't that level of spontaneity, which could restrict people using your services, or just in general navigation across something like a ship could be supported with assistive technology, announcements, and kind of being able to navigate the space before moving into the physical space is going to support confidence. So we keep talking about accessibility. So what is accessibility? Like I said before, it's the ability for everyone to access without barriers. This must be universal. So this also includes the digital space.
Mm-hmm. So what does the law say? So going back to the Equality Act, which I mentioned a moment ago, so this is really key to bear in mind. So the Equality Act serves two functions: to prevent, to to prevent people from being discriminated against, and also to create equal opportunities. So it's really worth bearing in mind as organizations and service providers that it's unlawful for service providers to treat disabled people less favorably based on their disability. So that means if places are inaccessible or digital spaces are inaccessible, that does sort of indirectly discriminate against disabled people. And then also a website is classified as a service. So to comply with the law, organizations must make reasonable adjustments, which means ensuring website accessibility. And when we talk about reasonable adjustments, that's sort of the cherry on top of inclusive design. So like what Rox was mentioning just now about design needing to be universally accessible. Universal design is the sort of new way of thinking in terms of how we are designing things to be more accessible, so that once we have that basis of accessibility, reasonable adjustments on a case-by-case basis, or they're not that big a deal, you know, we can make those small amends for those individuals because we already have that baseline of accessibility, and that's really what we're trying to promote here. And then looking at public sector bodies, accessibility regulations from 2018. So public sector website or mobile apps must meet the minimum accessibility guidance and be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So that's very much tapping into that sort of, you know, what is the bare minimum we need to be hitting when it comes to accessibility, and then considering the reasonable adjustments as that next step to ensuring that those individuals on a case-by-case basis are accommodated. Okay, so we're going to play a little bit of a video that dives into the Equality Act a bit more, just to talk you through it a little bit. Oh.
In this quick summary video, we're going to talk about the Equality Act 2010 and what this means for you and your workplace. The Equality Act came into force on the 1st of October 2010, and it brought together over 116 pieces of legislation that included the Equal Pay Act, the Equality Regulations, the Race Relations, Employment Law, and importantly for this video, the Disability Discrimination Act. The Equality Act is intended to protect individuals from discrimination from the protected characteristics in the workplace. It's very important to note that being a disabled person is a protected characteristic, and this means that a disabled person should not be discriminated against on grounds of their diversity. So what does this mean for you and your organization? Well, this is a legal requirement that requires you to ensure your workplace is inclusive and accessible. This may mean you need to make changes to ensure disabled people aren't treated unfavorably due to their diversity. How can I uphold the Act in the workplace? Here are a few suggestions. Ensure your policies and practices don't present barriers in the way that they're written and their intended outcomes. Remove the physical features that limit access, or provide reasonable assistive technology and services such as BSL interpretation or a hearing loop. These changes are what's known as reasonable adjustments. Often, there is a belief that inclusive changes are costly and expensive and only support one person. Mythbuster: making inclusive changes for one person can actually support many people, and many adjustments are actually made at no or low cost. Here's an example of inclusive practice. To ensure everyone can access company communications, this organization records its handbook onto audio CDs for individuals with visual impairments and sends out newsletters as an audio file where required. What is meant by anticipatory duty? Well, the Equality Act 2010 is an anticipatory duty, which means there's an expectation that an organization will make reasonable adjustments and can't wait until a disabled person is employed or uses their services. This means you need to think in advance about what adjustments might be needed. Not only is this a legal duty, it also makes good business sense. By embracing the anticipatory approach and welcome in your organization, you will attract and retain a diverse pool of talent.
So that was just a little bit of an introduction to the Equality Act, and we're going to move on to equity versus equality, and what that means, what that looks like, because I remember at the start someone said this is definitely of interest. So some of you may have seen this graphic before. There's three separate pictures with three individuals. The first picture, each individual has one box to enable them to look over a fence and see a baseball game. But not everyone can see using that one singular equally provided box. So if we move on to the second one, these boxes have been provided equitably. So they've been given as needed, which allows people to equally access the game. And if we move on to the third slide, those systematic barriers to that fence has been removed. Yes, there is chicken wire because we have health and safety, but actually, ultimately, those systematic barriers have been removed. And sometimes what you do see with this kind of array of images is a fourth image where we see more people coming because those barriers have been removed. So just a little bit of a reminder. Sorry, move on to the next slide. It's assumed that everyone will benefit from the same support. This means you're being treated equally. Individuals that are given different support to make the game more accessible, they are being treated equitably. And what we'd like to see is moving to the third and a potential fourth to remove those systematic barriers so that everyone can see the game without any support or accommodations.
So I think just to add a little bit here, when we're thinking about, how the diversity and inclusion space has progressed over the last few years, this is quite a good way to think about it. Before we did think we needed to be treating everyone equally. And that's when we heard phrases like, oh, I don't see color and things like that. But we've recognized now that actually that's not particularly helpful to use those kind of statements, because we do need to recognize those identities and, those identities that we all have that can then create those barriers to entry and accessibility. So we're shifting into that space of equity, while in the background we try to tackle these systemic barriers and break them down. Right now, what's really key is making sure that we're providing that equitable access in the meantime. So thinking about, sorry, go ahead, Rox.
No, carry on.
Okay.
Carry on.
So thinking about digital access and inclusion, so the impacts of not embedding inclusion into digital strategy. So what does that look like? And this kind of goes back to when we were talking about those barriers that people face. People are going to, face a multitude of different barriers themselves, and how that then affects the individual can show up in a multitude of different ways. So there might be individuals who start masking, which is the experience of neurodiverse individuals and particularly autistic individuals, who end up having to learn those social cues to sort of then participate in society to the standard that we consider to be normal. So they kind of put on a mask to hide their autistic traits. So, it's something like learning phrases to use in social cues, or to sort of suppress their stimming, which are those sort of repetitive movements that can actually be really calming and really good for, autistic people to be practicing, well, for a lot of neurodiverse people actually to be practicing. So creating spaces where people are having to mask can be quite detrimental to that individual's self-expression and their experience in the environment and how they move through the environment. So really key to bear in mind that we don't want to be creating those kind of spaces. Also, what it can create is disengagement with the venues, with the materials, with the content, just disengagement in general if you can't actually access it properly. If things are very inaccessible, hard to read or hard to navigate through, then often people will choose to not engage altogether. It also creates effects of imposter syndrome. So this can happen sort of within your workforces. You know, if the space is not accessible to your colleagues or employees, you know, it starts to, people tend to try and find ways to overcompensate for what is actually a lack of access, when one would assume that it's sort of a lack of more of their incapability to do the job effectively. But we need to sort of switch that thinking away. This is, again, that medical model thinking, switch it away from that individual thinking they're not doing their job properly, and recognizing that imposter syndrome might actually be created because they're just coming up against barrier after barrier. And thinking again, you know, what are those hidden barriers? So we'll come into detail around sort of written information, for example, and how things look digitally and how that can cause barriers that you may not be aware of. Stigma is a huge thing to bear in mind. People might not want to disclose any disabilities like dyslexia, for example, which has the stigma of, you know, being stupid or being slow or not understanding things. You know, that stigma can really cause someone to not disclose and mean that they're just constantly coming up against barriers, because unfortunately, still living in the medical model world, we need diagnoses that allows us access to support. And, you know, through programs like Access to Work, for example, which can get you funding for assistive technology, for example, you can only really receive that once you have that diagnosis. So that can sort of have these knock-on effects. It can also affect your own reputation as organizations not being accessible. You know, that can sort of create a backlash for yourselves. And then it will also sort of induce anxiety in individuals if they're struggling to access something. You know, it's both can cause that imposter syndrome anxiety, but also anxiety around using your services and maneuvering through services, and just having that general struggle can then just really create that anxiety and ultimately exclusion as well. So.
Absolutely. So how can we be anticipatory, and why is it so important? Making sure everyone feels included, as well as supported and treated fairly, and have access to equal opportunities. What's really important for us is to step back and say, okay, what barriers are there to change? What's working well? And how do we advertise and celebrate what we're able to do to support you? So we're going to just pop it back over to you just to check in, see how you're doing, and see what you feel the potential benefits of anticipatory inclusion can be to your digital strategy. So hopefully everyone's okay to get onto sliding. And then what we'll do is, just after this section, we're going into the real actionable kind of tools and tricks on what to do.
I think this is quite a good opportunity as well to kind of learn from each other and see, you know, what are other organizations thinking about, and other individuals, where are the different focuses. So it's really cool to start to see what people are responding to. Sorry.
And just to confirm, the code again is Media Trust 15.
Okay, so we've got some responses coming through. Making people feel welcome, fantastic. Access benefits all. Being proactive, not reactive. That's great. I'm glad that that's sunk in. That's definitely where we need to be moving these conversations around reasonable adjustments and disability. We need to be more proactive rather than just responding, trying to do the quick responses, reactive responses to the individual cases. Individuals who need accommodations are made to feel demanding. Yes, that's a huge one. That's a huge one of those hidden barriers, not wanting to sound like we're being too difficult when actually all we're asking for is just access. Help to attract visitors and attendees, not making people go through endless assessments. Yes, that's very much a medical model approach, that sort of need to assess someone's capabilities. Reaching wider society, empowering people, create a sense of belonging community. People feel confident in engaging with our organization. Fantastic. Really help thinking and allow you to comply with law. Yes, very much so. Reaching wider audience, future-proofing. Fantastic. We've got some really great inputs here. Okay, should I move it along, Rox?
Yes, absolutely. So we believe the benefits of anticipatory inclusion to your digital strategy will ultimately see an acceptance of diversity, a normalization of difference, and increased confidence. And that's not just within the people you work with, but the communities you also work with as well. And we feel that this is really going to help towards those aims of the heritage spaces. So obviously improving visitor engagement, people are aware of more opportunities for education, where we're being inclusive and offering inclusive opportunities. Actually, there may be opportunities there for more grants, but you're going to see an authentic kind of feeling of belonging, hopefully more people coming to those spaces, just like we saw with the equity versus equality. We believe there's going to be increased generational awareness, and you're going to be able to reach diverse talent within your communities. And that's ultimately going to grow the heritage space. Now, this is more of a visitor-facing fact, but I kind of found that quote really interesting, that there are nearly 40 million people living in the UK, and our worldwide leading heritage sector must ensure it's capitalising on the spending power of their household, which is worth 249 billion a year. I think why it's really important not only to think of it financially, but actually I think that speaks to the prevalence of disability and who interacts with that, and potential recruitment pools and audiences that we really need to take into consideration. So how do we do that? This is where we kind of go into the actionable tools, and then it's over to you for questions. Nikita, do you mind taking this for a moment?
Sure. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of things. So we're looking at visual accessibility. So if you have a look at this document, and just so it says on the document, what do you think of this document? Can you read it through and pick up the less accessible features? What do you think of this font size? And it is great to be accessible, but you need to think about whether your document helps many people, 300 people, or just one person. So having a look at this slide here, we're going to jump back onto Slido, and I'd love for you to pull out if you saw anything that you felt was inaccessible about that document. I'll jump back quickly before we fully get going on Slido. So just have a look at what is in front of you. And if you feel like there's anything that's inaccessible about this page, then it would be great if you can start populating the Slido answers, and then we'll run through some really sort of key tips around sort of visual accessibility. So if anyone has any thoughts, okay, fantastic. Italics and size, text too small, middle font too small. Fantastic. Font use, yep, capitals. Amazing. Horrible fonts, yes. Difficult to read in font styles. Serif fonts, fantastic. You are picking up on a lot of key things. Number inconsistency, fantastic. Switching from numbers to written numbers, fantastic. Amazing. Okay, so I think you've random capitalization, brilliant. Okay, so you've all managed to pick up on some really key inaccessibility features. So I'll run through why this is sort of the bare minimum that we need to be hitting when it comes to accessibility and the effects that it has. So I think when it comes to visual accessibility, especially for neurodiverse people and dyslexics in particular who struggle with reading, it's really key to remember that, reading is something that us as human beings invented. It's not something we were naturally designed to do. And now we've put a lot of emphasis on reading as one of our key forms of communication, but it does create a huge barrier for a large number of people people. Reading, the practice of reading uses 3 parts of our right-hand side of the brain, left-hand side of the brain, when in fact, you know, more neurodiverse people are stronger on their right-hand side of the brain. So it's really key to ensure that when we're creating written materials, that we make them as accessible as possible. To avoid people facing that barrier. So when it comes to font size, minimum font size 12 for any documents, that's the most accessible. A lot of you pulled out that font in the middle was too small. For presentations or anything digitally on screen, it would be minimum font size 18. However, with documents on screen, we would still say, you know, keep that size 12 as a minimum. Use sans serif fonts. So you have serif fonts and sans serif fonts. A serif font is something like Times New Roman that has all the little flicks or embellishments at the end of each letter. And that really affects what's called the kerning, which is the space between the letters. And if that's been affected, then it often means that individuals who struggle with reading, dyslexics in particular, when we're looking at those words, they can blur into one, or we'll miss letters, or we'll misread letters. And it's very hard for us to identify where that mistake has happened. So rather using sans serif fonts, which is something like Arial or Calibri or Roboto, or any of those sort of more succinct fonts that don't have any of the embellishments, is really key. Color contrast. So when we're using colors, make sure that, you know, backgrounds and fonts are the appropriate contrast. So as you can see here, we've got a light blue background and dark navy text. So there's enough of a contrast between those colors to make it clear enough. The absolute worst color contrast that there is a white background with black text, which unfortunately is the default for absolutely everything. The way our world was designed has pretty much led us to default white black background and black text. And that is just really inaccessible. It's predominantly because of the white background. It causes a really dazzling effect and causes something called the river effect, where we would actually see the white spaces between the letters and the words rather than the actual words themselves. So the number one key tip would be avoid the white background as much as possible, rather opt for an off-white or a light gray or light pastel color. Or if you're using paper, think of getting buff paper or alternative colored papers, just to avoid that white. Use proper headings. So for screen readers or anyone, so people who are visually impaired, or a lot of neurodiverse people use screen readers to navigate online. And headings are very key for that navigation. So if you have a document, if those headings are headed correctly and tagged correctly, that will just allow for an ease of flow through the document and allow one to navigate through the document appropriately and not miss any key information. Avoid capitals for continuous text. That really disrupts the flow of reading and can be really hard to sort of continue understanding what was being said if you then have to jump to then being able to distinguish the capital letters. Numbers 1 to 9, use the full words of 1 to 9. It's easier to read the full word of 1 to 9 than it is to read the digits. However, if you're doing anything above 10, any numbers above 10, then it's easier to read the digits. And this applies to time if you're putting times down as well. And avoid italics. Italics are really difficult to read as neurodiverse people. The slantiness means that the words the letters get skewed and are a bit harder to distinguish, but also a lot of screen readers don't pick up italics. So if something's in italics, then that will be missed by a screen reader, and that could be a huge chunk of information that is now inaccessible. So really key to bear these in mind. So over to you, Rox.
So how can we make audio content more accessible? We just wanted to get your initial reactions and ideas, and we'll just have our kind of rundown of tips and lists to consider when creating audio to ensure it's accessible. Transcripts, that's great. Transcripts.
Perfect. Yep. British Sign Language, that's BSL. Hearing loops, loop systems, that's for live events. That's really, really key. Supplement with subtitles, limited background noise, closed captions, descriptions of missing context, audio control options. Amazing. Appropriate.
I think people have seen our slides beforehand.
I know.
I'm convinced. Got a good group here.
Brilliant. Okay, do you want to run through those, Rox?
So like you said, we won't labour on this point too much, as it sounds like you guys have got a good grasp. So allow for live transcripts for all audio content when giving a live kind of talk. I can't get my words out. Always try and record that and be able to upload it after the event with closed captions. Keep background noise to a minimum, so if people are not talking, encourage that mute button. BSL interpretation where possible, and we'll go through this quickly later, where we would say if you were to organise an event, to ask for access information beforehand, and if that is required, then this is where we would recommend that BSL interpretation. Try and speak clearly and at a natural pace. For lip readers, don't be tempted to shout. It can distort your lips and affect kind of clarity of what you're saying. Pause to allow people to process. Like I said, if someone's talking, ask people to mute their mics, and use integrated technology such as auto-generated captions on Instagram and YouTube. Alt text is a way of communicating what is in a picture to an individual that may not be able to see it traditionally. It's more commonly seen on social media, but can be actually used within our documents and Word. Usually alt text is 125 characters or less. The purpose of alt text is to give basic or essential information about an image. You may have seen this alt text if an image doesn't load when you open an email, and this kind of 2-line image description should show instead. It's going to read it to those screen readers. And an example of alt text for the picture we have on the screen is simply a puddle of juice on a countertop. So, image descriptions. This is something that is slightly longer and usually more detailed. This isn't just read out by screen readers. This can be visually accessible to those who traditionally read, and as I said, gives more detail than alt text. So an example of this picture, again, using an alt image description, would be a puddle of orange juice spilling out of a tall glass in the middle of a countertop. Consider including placement, image styles, colours, named animals or clothes if important, as well as emotions or surroundings. Try and leave out obvious features, for example, if they have a nose, but for example, if it's important or different, such as if you were describing a picture of Voldemort, you might want to actually include he doesn't have a nose, because that is slightly different and not necessarily obvious. If the image is decorative, we do recommend that you just add nil, which allows people to understand that the picture isn't relevant necessarily to the tone or give any further information.
Great. Okay, so descriptive link text. So we have two options here. There's option A, which reads, click here to read about our company, or option B, which means to learn more about our company, read about us. So out of those two options, which one do you feel is more accessible? So A is click here, or B is about us. So we're going to jump back onto Slido. So love to see what you're thinking here. And we've got an A in the comments. Let's see, so 73% are choosing B, and it's moving around. Okay, so we've got predominant, majority of people have chosen B. I can see A sliding up a little bit. So So I will jump straight into which one is more accessible. So that would be B. So well done to everyone who chose B. And that's because if you're using a screen reader, for example, and you're going through a document, the screen reader itself will call out if there's a link there. And as you can see, when you do add the link, it's highlighted in a different color and underlines it. So it's clear that there is something to be connecting you through to another site there. So why we say the descriptive one is more accessible is because if someone is going through a document with a screen reader, they would have to listen to the full sentence if the option was click here to read about our company. If you had loads of different links like that, they'd need to listen to every single full sentences although they already know that there is a link there because they would have been told so by the screen reader. Whereas if you opt for option B, where you're linking about us, then they can just jump through, okay, we're at about us or people or D&I commitment or whatever it is that we're linking through. And people will be able to jump through and find those links with ease and know exactly what they're choosing rather than having to listen to the full sentence. So always opt for that more descriptive option. PDFs. So why are we talking about PDFs here? So keep PDFs accessible. PDFs are notoriously inaccessible, so much so that Adobe PDF software has actually attached an accessibility feature to the software, which we would really recommend using. So what makes PDFs accessible? If we're going to keep them accessible, we need to make sure that the text is selectable so that people can sort of either pull the text out if they need to move it into a more accessible document or highlight it. For certain screen readers need to highlight the text to be able to read it out. So that needs to happen. Make sure background color is anything but white, as we've discussed. The flow of the document. So this is where the key part of the inaccessibility of PDFs comes from, is often they will shift the paragraphs around. So if you're listening, if you're consuming the document through a screen reader, it'll start playing paragraph 3 and then paragraph 1 and then paragraph 5. This happens a lot, which is why they've attached that feature, that accessibility feature. So when you run it through the program, it'll be able to make sure that the flow is in the right order. Properly tagged and correct headers. So this goes back to that point of what we were saying about headers earlier, so that people can navigate through the document with ease. So we need to make sure that those are being tagged properly. And then use PDFs only where necessary. So I know people feel quite uncomfortable sharing Word documents, or there might be, I don't know, some legal implications about sharing Word documents if you have that raw document. However, that is the more accessible option because people can then tailor those documents to their preferred background colors and font size and font choices that is more accessible to them. So where possible, share a Word document or ensure that the PDF is as accessible as possible. Or can we start thinking about, including audio files as well, or video descriptions, or, just think about more alternative ways that you can share that information that's not just in the PDF format. And then again, if you are creating a document that's going to be a PDF, make sure to apply all of those visual tips as well. Over to you, Rox.
As you said, there's some really great built-in checkers that you can use on most of the Microsoft suites, and Adobe Acrobat Pro has a built-in checker. What I would say, because we could do a whole session on this and how to access tools, is really go into Microsoft Suite and have a play around. Honestly, there's some really great accessibility features, but one that I'd always say is go into View and always try and check the accessibility. It's going to talk you through the flow of the document. It's going to point out whether it's going to be clear for someone who's processing, and it will also give you alt text prompts. So I can't believe it's nearly 11 o'clock already. I've been planning this for weeks and can't believe the time's gone. So what we'll do is I'm just going to run through some really good points for making sure that your events are inclusive. I feel like we have embedded these kind of thoughts and feelings throughout, but it's really good just to reconfirm that, and then it will be over to you. So we're creating inclusive meetings and events, especially online, ensure transcriptions are available and closed captions are on. Make the agenda available as soon as possible. This helps people plan their day and be able to bring or arrange the support they might need. Always building comfort breaks. Usually if the session's over an hour, we do about 10 minutes per hour. Have a safe space agreement, which we will be going through in a minute. And again, like we said before, enable mics to be muted so that chats can be more focused, and there's a removal of distractions.
So inclusive, so the pre-event logistics and considerations. So when it comes to the date and time, give as much notice as possible. That sort of ties back in with what Rox was saying about sharing the agenda as early as possible, as that just gives people opportunities to organize their day appropriately. For disabled people, there might be a number of appointments or medication that they may need to be taking. So it's really worthwhile bearing in mind the timings. People also have care responsibilities and parental responsibilities, so really considering those needs as well. And then when having an event, really key to have access to request access requirements as early as possible. This can really help for budgeting considerations as well. So if you need a BSL interpreter, British Sign Language interpreter, you can organize and make sure that that's in place ahead of time, rather than saying we need to have that at every event, because unfortunately when it comes to accessibility, it is hard to accommodate everyone. So as much early information as we can have as possible will really then allow you to plan all of those access needs.
And just to confirm, so access needs could also include, it doesn't have to be someone with a disability. It might be that they're in a low kind of digital area, low bandwidth area, and they need access to the slides beforehand, for example.
Yes, yeah, having access to the slides beforehand is a really also great way of ensuring inclusivity and accessibility as well, so people can familiarize themselves with the content if need be, or if someone's using a screen reader, for example, can then know what they're following along with. Pronoun preferences, if we can give space for people to share their preferred pronouns, and then we just create that sort of more accepting and accommodating environment, and we're not making any sort of assumptions or binary assumptions on people's gender is really key as well. And then pronunciations, are we sure that we know exactly how to pronunciate everyone's names, and that we're feeling confident to do so, because that can be quite a unsettling experience if you get your name mispronounced. So making sure that we are bearing that in mind.
So as promised, we just wanted to go through what a safe space statement is, because we think it's a really valuable tool in the digital space, just to help with engagement. So this can be a statement set out by an organisation. It can be read at the beginning of meetings and shared in advance. It shares the organisation's commitment to promoting equity and good practice in meetings. It's designed to be anti-discriminatory and celebrates difference, and allows individuals to share, feel welcome and participate equitably. And this is just an example of one a DNA put together earlier. Sounded a bit like Blue Peter then, I didn't mean it to.
Do you want me to?
Yes, please. Is that okay? Spasm came at the wrong time.
No problem. Okay, so this is our safe space statement. Everything that we do has equity and diversity at its heart. By enabling all of our community to participate in everything we do, we are helping to progress towards a fairer and more equitable society. DNA is committed to providing an open-minded and safe environment in which our community can learn, live, and work in a space where difference is celebrated and individuals feel like they belong. Having a safe space means that every member of our community should feel welcome to participate in enabling non-judgmental and non-threatening discussions, activities, services, or events, which are free from threats, discrimination, harassment, and unsafe or unwelcoming conditions.
So just our final top tips before we pass over to you. When creating events and inclusive online spaces, think visually. Can people access it? Consider audio accessibility. Is it a safe, welcoming space? Be mindful of language and the language we use. Is the panel of speakers a diverse representation and the representation you want of your sector or spaces? And is there equitable contribution options, such as today's Slido?
Brilliant. Rob, I love your points around pronunciation in the chat around Welsh and Scottish names. I lived in Glasgow for a couple of years, and learning how to pronounce Ailey, Ewan, and Vary based on the spelling was quite an experience as a dyslexic. So it's really key to kind of make sure that we are familiarizing ourselves with pronunciations for sure. Okay, so we are jumping back into Slido just to get a little bit of your feedback, and this is really key for us to know what's really stuck with a lot of people. So please do share one key thing you have learned today. We've just got a few of these Slido questions, and then we'll go straight into the Q&A section. B, not A, fantastic for descriptive link text. Avoid white backgrounds. Thank you so much. That makes me so happy to see. Didn't realize the white backgrounds and black text was the worst combination. Fantastic. That's really stuck. I love that.
I think that is one of the common revelations, isn't it? I think.
Yeah. And I think because it's been a default forever since its inception, we don't really know to question it. And I didn't realize that actually my incapability of reading was not really because I'm stupid or slow or anything, it was just because of the actual physical accessibility of those documents. Okay, we've got some great things. Think visually, fonts, visual representation of equality versus equity was brilliant, fantastic. Glad that was helpful. Knew about social but not celebratory model, amazing. Celebrating my organ, we can always be doing more. There's always more that can be done for sure. Be proactive, I love that. Visual presentation tips, fantastic. Equity, meaning, this is great to see. Some practical accessibility tips. Something else that I would recommend is switching all of your digital your laptop, your phone, your tablet to dark mode. That was just like my eyes taking a massive sigh of relief when I did that, because that's switching everything from the white backgrounds to the dark backgrounds. So I would definitely recommend doing that.
I'm sorry, I think it was Amanda. I apologize if I missed the name. There's a lot of messages popping up. I don't know if we're doing the session again with Media Trust. I wouldn't want to say that on live event because I don't know. But if this is something that could be supportive to you or a session similar, feel free to contact DNA, and our information was at the start, and we'll put it again at the end, if that's helpful. And you can also signpost that you've been in a session with us, which would be great.
Okay, so another quick question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much did you enjoy today's session? 1 is low, 5 is high. We'll try not to take it too personally if you give us a 1. But great to see we've got a lot of 5 so far.
I would just like to say thank you to Nikita for popping in 10 minutes before the session to help me, because I wasn't very well this morning. So she's been very celebratory, and we thrive today.
No problem. And Barbara, yes, I'm sorry about the Slido. Unfortunately, because it was such a quick hour to get through a lot of content, we had to jump through those quickly. So apologies if those went too quick. Okay, and I think we have one more Slido question, which is please share 3 words that sum up how you feel after the session. So if you just put them in 1 word at a time, and it'll create a nice little word cloud. If you see a word pop up that really resonates with you, then please put that in again, because it'll just kind of make the words much bigger. And we'll see what has really stuck with a lot of people. As you can see,
I love scene. I love the fact that scene's on there.
Yes. I love that too. Fantastic. Slido is very inaccessible in the beginning, but then it shifts. Okay, informed, fantastic. Motivated, inspired, challenged. I love that. Empowered, humbled, helpful, confident, better informed, proactive, knowledgeable, confident, encouraged, determined, educated, curious, grateful, amazing. These are fantastic words. I'm really loving to see this. Brilliant.
Yeah, it's honestly been a really good session. It's a shame it hadn't been longer, so we weren't able to really see or interact, but I'm really hoping with the questions and everything afterwards we'll be able to support you, and of course get in touch with DNA if we can support with things. I think Amanda had a question about kind of support with making websites accessible. We do website accessibility audits and can support with that as well.
Hello again, guys. Thank you so much, Roxanne and Nikita. That was such a good session, and I've seen so many compliments in the chat, so scroll through that if you want an ego boost later. Yeah, lots of people have said that it was a really inspirational and practical session, so that's so nice to see. Yeah, so we do have a few questions. Let me dive right in, seeing as we've got 10 minutes. So Rob asked about color contrast. Is there a handy guide on what color contrasts to avoid because they clash or are indistinguishable to some people? Recent news about football shirts, change of color stripes for some teams playing others.
That's a really great question. It's a difficult one with colors because it can be very personal, and a lot of people can be affected by color blindness with specific colors. So, you know, the more we sort of dive into the world of accessibility, the more options we start to discover, the more it makes it harder to sort of like choose one sort of standard color that would suit anyone. So that's why when you see a lot of websites that are really embracing accessibility, they'll have the AT toolbar is something that a lot of companies are using now, their access toolbar, which allows individuals to then actually choose their own color contrasts and find ones that work for them themselves. So if you go onto the DNA website, there are about 4 different color contrast options that you can choose between and settle on which one works best for you. So I wish I could give you one clear answer on what is the best color contrast, but it is very much dependent on the individual. So have a play with what works best for you. And that's also why we recommend things like sharing Word documents, for example, so people can really then tailor documents and things to their own personal preferences.
Absolutely, and there's some great resources on our website, or just check contrast checkers. There's some really good ones online as well.
Thank you so much, both. Oh,
so
go ahead, Roxanne.
diversityandability.com. I can put it on the last slide, but it's because we haven't got down there. I don't think. Is it on the next slide, Nikita?
Yeah, there we go.
Cool.
Oh, thank you, guys. Yeah, I'll paste that into the chat at some point too, if you guys want to just copy it. Yeah, thank you. Oh, well, something you've already mentioned, Nikita, just now, links to the next question, which is there a better type of document to use rather than PDFs? And I know you've already mentioned Word.
Yeah, we would say Word documents, but I know there is that discomfort with being editable documents. So unfortunately, there isn't a better alternative to PDFs when it comes to uneditable documents. So that's why we would then recommend running any PDF through that accessibility checker on the Adobe software to ensure that the structure of the document is in place, and it will pull up any parts of the document that are inaccessible that need you to work on them.
Thank you so much. Another question from Rob here. So I guess this was at some point during your presentation when you talked about alternative text, but he said, you have just gone through additional alternative text for images. What about good practice for artifacts, such as museum pieces and the on-site or on digital interpretation panels?
So there's certain apps that you could use that help people identify what's around, so that you can use QR codes. I think it's called Navida, isn't it? One of the main ones that they use in those sorts of spaces. But basically there are options for like QR codes and things, so people can scan them and it will describe, or people can download apps such as Seeing Eye and get an individual to describe what they're seeing. Maybe that's something that can be done in for example, a heritage space also.
I think something quite key that Rox is tapping into here is, we really need to work towards normalizing assistive technology, because, it's not just for disabled people. It really, so much of what we use today is assistive technology. The spell check on your phone or your Alexas or Velcro shoes, those were all designed for accessibility. So the more we can normalize that use of assistive tech, the more people will be able to interact in your spaces as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you so much, guys. Well, yeah, I guess you guys have already touched on this, but Tracy was asking, can we contact you direct for consultancy in future? And I guess that's more information on the website, isn't it?
Yeah, but absolutely, if you email, say that you're in a session with myself and Nikita, that's absolutely fine, because I will get access to that as part of my role. So you'll probably speak to me. Great. Sometimes, yes, we do pro bono work. Obviously, can't guarantee it on, just to say so, but we do have digital justice projects and a budget to support that.
Lovely. So Ian Watson said, if you can't anticipate everything, how do you work out how far to anticipate?
Great question. So I think what I was talking about in terms of reasonable adjustments sort of being the cherry on top of inclusive design, it really starts with like the embedding that groundwork of inclusive design, inclusive policies, and inclusive practices. So really sort of tapping into your organization and your work from the bottom up, like, are all our policies and practices, our recruitment policies, our all of it, are we using the right inclusive language, and are we considering accessibility, and really ensuring that we're sort of hitting that sort of bare minimum standard. An option would be to go through an organization like DNA, where we can do those audits and help you sort of embed inclusivity in multiple aspects of the organization. Otherwise, just, a lot of the practical tips that we've given now, if you can start to really embed those and build that understanding around accessibility and consideration, and be as transparent as possible. We see a lot of places, a lot of venues saying, oh, we strive to be as accessible, but that's not really helpful, because we need to know if a place is accessible or not. We need as clear information as possible. And if, we know with a lot of heritage sites, and especially places like London, can be quite physically inaccessible just by design, historically, and that's hard to get around, and we recognize that. So, just being as transparent and clear in terms of what are your sort of access at the moment, and then giving direct contact details on who can be contacted when it comes to access needs, and then doing the sort of like case by case, while, like we were saying, in the background, trying to tackle those bigger inaccessible challenges.
I think it's about celebrating what you can do, so shouting about it, be proud that you can give support here and there, but also be honest. It's a lot about being honest. When someone says, is it accessible, the answer 9 times out of 10 isn't yes. There's a lot more detail and a lot more conversation to be had. So I think for me, it's about celebrating what you have already, and not necessarily knowing the answers, but knowing where to go within your organizations to get the support if questions are asked.
Great, thank you both. We probably have time for like maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So I'll go to an anonymous question. When you have limited resources and significant challenges within your website, how do you prioritize your approach to accessibility?
Nikita, did you want me to take this? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
So basically, what I would say is look at the changes that can benefit everyone, and things that can be done cost effectively. First, for example, checking your language, visual accessibility, and the images you're using. And social media is probably quite a quick fix to be made more inclusive from day one. So looking at what you can do now, what's actionable within a budget. But actually what DNA do is we can do inclusion maturity reviews. So we can review where you are in a business and actually give you a tangible action plan where we work together to achieve the goals. So if you were to get in touch, I'll be able to do it in more detail and go through it with you.
Thank you so much for that, Roxanne. Okay, so we have 1 minute till the end of the session, so I probably won't ask you another question, so you don't have to try and answer in like literally 20 seconds. But yeah, thank you so much, Roxanne and Nikita. I personally have learned so much today, and I'm sure lots of other people have. So thank you so much for your time. This was an excellent session, and Slido was lots of fun.
Yes,
Amazing.
thank you for everyone's participation, and thanks again to Nikita.
No, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having us. It's been a really great session. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, and just to remind everyone, we will share the slides and recording from the session in the coming few next weeks. But yeah, look out for that in the newsletter from Heritage Digital. Thank you all so much.
Perfect.
Have a
Thank
lovely
you.
day.